alcohol became sort of this like magic potion that allowed me to feel comfortable in my own skin for the first time.
I think, we may be in the midst of a major cultural shift, which is the demotion of the moderate drinker.
I think it's good to be a good consumer of knowledge, but you first have to have the knowledge to be a consumer of it. And the relationship between alcohol and cancer has not been made available to the public.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. We take tough topics and share perspectives that will help us see the issue with more empathy and nuance. We're out to become better citizens, kinder neighbors, and more effective advocates. I'm glad you're here. Today, making sense of alcohol's shifting status in American life.
I mean, alcohol was everywhere. Every party that I went to, every dinner, was at a restaurant where we were ordering drinks.
Sarah Levy came of age in the late 2000s, immersed in a culture of drinking as both fun and empowering.
I had grown up on this steady diet of Sex and the City and the OC and shows where I saw characters who were drinking and doing it in a way where it looked glamorous, it looked cool, it looked fun. I also came up with this mentality of girls can do anything that boys can do. I saw drinking, I write about this in my book, Drinking Games. I saw drinking as a feminist act. I could keep up with boys in the classroom and later, at work and at the bar, at the party. I could go shot for shot, drink for drink. And it felt like an act of rebellion in a sense.
Levy's book is Drinking Games. It's a memoir, and it's a cautionary tale about the cultural messaging around alcohol in America that had her convinced her struggle to moderate her own drinking was a personal flaw.
I was surrounded by peers who were killing it in the classroom, in the gym, had relationships, had so much going on, summer jobs and internships and prestigious fellowships and grants, and they were partying too, and I just didn't know how they were able to do it all. And I felt like something was wrong with me, that I couldn't drink in this normal way and keep up with everyone.
What's normal in America today is at least one drink of alcohol a week. A quarter of adults report binge drinking in the past month. Alcohol consumption in the U.S. hit a modern peak in the 1980s before declining a bit. By the 2000s, when Sarah Levy was watching all those glamorous actors drinking on soapy teen dramas, alcohol use in the U.S. was again on the rise. But the pandemic drove up drinking a whopping 20%, probably because of isolation, boredom, and stress. Americans have been gradually consuming less alcohol since then. And look, a little alcohol is good for you, right? That is what the science has said for a long time, that a weekly glass of wine in particular is part of a healthy diet. But more recently, public health messages are shifting. The U.S. Surgeon General just put out a whole report highlighting the cancer risk associated with alcohol. I'm sure you've also noticed the sober curious #Dry January movement gaining traction on social media. A quarter of college students even say they don't drink at all. That's up 10% from 20 years ago. Is a significant shift happening here? Well, that's part of what we're exploring today on Top of Mind. But more fundamentally, we're looking at a question that has always intrigued me. How did alcohol become such an ever-present part of American life when barely a century ago the nation outlawed it completely? Let me just disclose here that I don't drink. I grew up around it. Both of my grandpas drank pretty heavily. In my career, I've become well-versed in the art of nursing a soda at networking events and declining that glass of wine when the waiter comes around at a fancy dinner. Alcohol has honestly just never appealed to me. But the main reason I don't drink is because I'm a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which, like a lot of religions, prohibits alcohol. Now, Sarah Levy's upbringing was different. Her dad is French. A glass of wine or champagne was an essential part of a good meal. A simple pleasure her father would let her sip from time to time at the table. But when Levy took more than a sip for the first time at a high school party, alcohol became something much more to her.
I felt a lot of pressure to be, a good girl, to get good grades. I was a perfectionist. It just felt like a pressure cooker. So that first experience drinking felt like such a relief and such a weight lifted off of my shoulders. It was like the volume was being turned down on all of those inner voices telling me, you're not good enough, you're not thin enough, you're not funny enough. And so alcohol became sort of this like magic potion that allowed me to feel comfortable in my own skin for the first time. I quickly became a blackout drinker, a binge drinker, because I would just, I didn't have the ability to moderate. Whereas my friend standing next to me is still just nursing that first drink.
Yeah. When you say blackout, what do you mean?
Yeah, so a blackout is characterized as an inability to form short-term memories and store them because of the alcohol that's flooded your brain. So it's not the same as passing out. You're still awake and in many cases, able to carry on a conversation. And for me, I was able to walk, stand upright, but you could tell that like the lights weren't quite on. I would remember everything, up until a certain point in the night. And then after a certain number of drinks, and it was always like a different number of drinks, depending on how strong they were, it was very hard to kind of nail down. But I would just wake up the next morning not knowing how I had gotten home or how the night had ended. And I would sort of need my friends to fill in the blanks. And it's scary because you don't know what you're doing. You're not in control.
Her drinking became especially regular when she left home, first in college and then as a young professional working in New York City.
Among at least, my friends, my peers, many of them have either had a blackout or have seen people around them black out. So it was very normalized. And I thought it was just sort of what happened to most people when they drank.
So it didn't seem like a problem to you then?
No, it didn't seem like a problem. I didn't love the way I felt the next morning. I felt fear. I felt anxiety. I felt shame. But I felt like I needed to figure out how to continue doing it because other people were doing it. Everyone was drinking. I've had conversations now with so many of my friends where they were like, we were drinking water in between cocktails. Like we could feel ourselves getting drunk and we would slow down. I remember sitting in my therapist's office in New York and talking about this and saying, I really want to drink normally. I want to moderate. And we sat together and we said, okay, well, you'll have 3 drinks. That seems reasonable over the course of a night. And I really had every intention of doing that and sticking with that and having water in between. And I remember one night going out to dinner with a friend and, saying, I'm only going to have 3 drinks tonight. And 3 drinks just can go by really fast. And, I had the first drink and then you're eating dinner, so you don't really feel the buzz. So then you want the second drink and then that starts to feel really good. But then there's only one more drink left, right? The best thing I can compare it to is dieting, and telling yourself like you can only have 3 bites of ice cream. And it's like the most delicious thing, the thing you want the most. By the time you're up to that 3rd bite, like you want more. I believe that I have a physical allergy to alcohol where once I have that first sip, I can't stop after that first sip because I want more and more and more. I want to keep this feeling going for as long as possible. And so
why was sobriety not on the table for you at that point? Like if it was so stressful and also, so clearly difficult for you to change your consumption habits, what stopped you from just going cold turkey and committing to that? Like, I'm done with this.
I think there were a couple of things. One, I think it's helpful to zoom out and remember where we were culturally at that time. We were not having these conversations. I had never heard the term sober curious. I remember Googling articles trying to find anyone, any really like young woman, but I would have taken anyone who was open about being sober and happy. There were so many accounts of people hitting rock bottom. And, that was the only depiction of sobriety and recovery that I could find. And so a big thing that stopped me was shame and a real fear of what people would think. Like, what will people say?
But finally, 4 days after her 28th birthday in 2017, Sarah Levy decided it was time.
What happened was a night that I had had so many times. It wasn't my worst night. I just woke up and had blacked out and didn't remember how the night had ended. And I had been out with a boss of mine and just was mortified that like he had seen me like that and felt really embarrassed and just felt like I'm done. And I had told myself that like 28, for whatever reason, was going to be the year, it was going to be my year. And I wouldn't be a mess. I wasn't going to be hungover on the weekends. And, 4 days in, I'm doing the same thing. And it just kind of like hit me that nothing changes if nothing changes. I had to actually remove this one variable from the equation. And I don't remember thinking, I will never, ever drink again for the rest of my life. I just knew that I had to stop.
Yeah. How did you do it? Get sober? So
I started with an honest conversation with my therapist, and said, like, I think I need help and I want to stop drinking, and looked for recovery programs and groups in my neighborhood and found a support system that way. Found 12-step recovery. And for me, being able to connect with other women, in particular, young women who were in the same life stage and who drank the way that I did, was profoundly helpful. And they really helped me navigate my old life with my new resolve to stay sober. So weddings and dates and work events and happy hours, all of those things, I still was surrounded by alcohol all the time in very early sobriety. And that temptation and that fear and what will people think if I say no, I think it would have been very hard to navigate that alone. So finding a community and a support system was everything for me.
What did people say when you said no? What was the range of responses you got when they found out you weren't drinking at whatever party or on whatever date?
A lot of people didn't really care. A lot of people, which was such a shock because I had been so convinced that everyone would have an opinion. Most people were like, that's cool. Oh, is that a new thing? Or why don't you drink? But very like offhanded. And I started to feel better so quickly. Physically better, emotionally better. I was sleeping better. I felt clearer. I felt less anxious. I felt like when I laughed, like I felt the joy in a way that I hadn't for a long time. I remember feeling like my worst day without alcohol was better than my best night of drinking. I got married in sobriety. I had my son a year and a half ago. I became a mom, which has been like the joy of my life. And being a sober mom is the biggest blessing.
Do you think about how you're going to handle those conversations with him, when he's a teenager and at the parties? And he's at the parties where the alcohol is going to come up as an option for him?
In my ideal scenario, my husband and I will have the kind of relationship with my son where we have an open dialogue. I felt like I had to hide my drinking from my parents because I knew it was wrong. And I do wonder, if I had been able to say, like, this is what happened when I started to drink, and what does drinking responsibly look like, and how many drinks should you have, and what do you drink, and how much is it? Like, is it a shot? Is it like, I didn't know anything about serving sizes or whatever. So I would love to be able to have an open dialogue and say, like, if you're going to drink, try to have, water and do not drive. You can always call us. We will come and get you. You will not be in trouble. I think if I've learned anything from my own experience, it's that I had all the right influences. I knew it was wrong and I still did it. So if he's going to do it and he's going to be curious, I would rather him not lie on top of it.
It's also possible, though, that her son just won't be as interested in alcohol.
Gen Z does have a different relationship with alcohol. And I think that has a lot to do with just shifting perspectives in our society around health and wellness and being more mindful about like the effects of what we put in our bodies. I think that you're seeing movements like sober curiosity pick up popularity. And I think people are re-examining their relationship with alcohol. But I still think that for so many people, it is a crutch and a way to overcompensate for, uncomfortable emotions that we might be having.
Sarah Levy is a writer, and she's author of the memoir, Drinking Games. Thank you for sharing your story with us today, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
Levy didn't realize it at the time, but the message she had so internalized about the ideal drinker being someone who could enjoy alcohol freely but never go too far is a strategic invention of the alcohol industry. It was developed and reinforced by a whole battalion of marketers and PR executives to justify bringing alcohol back to American life after Prohibition. That history is coming up next here on Top of Mind from BYU Radio. I'm Julie Rose. Hey, it's Julie, inviting you to embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Immerse yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. Join host Sam Payne and the live studio audience in laughter and delight as they explore a tapestry of tales. Tune in to The Appleseed for a family-friendly experience that sparks imagination and brings stories to life. It's your ticket to fun and creativity. Find The Appleseed wherever you listen to podcasts. Only once in all of U.S. history has a constitutional amendment been passed to repeal another constitutional amendment. It happened in the span of just 13 years, from 1920 to 1933, because of alcohol. So starting as early as the 1820s, the movement to ban alcohol in America was building momentum, centered around the social evils that alcohol seemed to encourage: drunkenness, prostitution, gambling, the whole saloon culture. But what really convinced America to outlaw liquor was World War I.
Which creates circumstances in which the prohibitionists can say, we're now in a wartime emergency, we need a disciplined, sober fighting force, and we need to conserve food for the war effort, and brewing and distilling is a waste of food.
Lisa Jacobson wrote a book about this called Intoxicating Pleasures. She's a history professor at UC Santa Barbara.
They're also playing on the, jingoism of the war, the intense anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly against immigrants from Germany and Italy, Jewish immigrants who are associated with the wine, beer, and distilling industries. So it becomes very difficult to mount an effective opposition in the war without being accused of being unpatriotic.
The 18th Amendment gets ratified in 1920, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal everywhere in the United States. But drinking doesn't stop. It just goes underground and keeps causing problems.
There was a sense that this just wasn't working. Instead of reducing crime, it had created an entirely new breed of criminal, the gangster and his ties to organized crime, that it was breeding disrespect for the law. And then you get the Great Depression, which gives a new pragmatic argument to the campaigners for repeal that we need to re-legalize alcohol in order to bring back jobs, revive the economy, provide farmers who are plagued by overproduction. We need to give them an outlet for their grains and grapes.
The argument works. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. But the battle's not over because alcohol still has the old baggage around drunkenness and crime. If this is going to stick, reformers who fought to overturn prohibition realize that alcohol needs a new look.
What's interesting is how many different types of people with different vested interests enter this campaign to promote moderate drinking. And so you have scientists who are giving very friendly testimony at congressional hearings trying to decide whether to give an early reprieve to beer and wine before prohibition is fully repealed. And they make the argument that if Americans learn to drink wine and beer as intended, sort of modeled after the family-friendly German beer garden or modeled after the French and Italian tradition of drinking wine with meals in a leisurely fashion, that Americans can be put back on the right path. So there's a sense that wine and beer can help wean Americans from their Prohibition-era excesses.
Meaning that beer and wine were less intoxicating than a cocktail, than whiskey?
Yes, because of the setting in which they're consumed, that this was the argument, the setting in which they're consumed, the potency of it, the fact that they're drunk with meals or food. And most significantly, I think the other key argument was to consume them in the civilizing presence of women. So there was this idea that women who had once been the foot soldiers of the Prohibition movement could be enlisted as the new guardians of pleasure, who would really determine and help people drink in a moderate kind of fashion. Let's not humor the drunk anymore. Let's make vulgar excess a taboo. And it was up to women to really enforce that.
Professor Jacobson, one of the things that's so fascinating about your book is these advertisements that you provide in the book. There's one that, back in the day, advertisements had lots of fine print. It seems like we don't use as many words in our ads anymore, but there's like this little essay. It's from the House of Seagram, and it has a picture of hands holding bread, like cutting a rustic loaf of bread. And the headline is, "We don't want bread money. Liquor is one of the luxuries of life to be bought and enjoyed only after the necessities are provided. Whoever needs bread for himself or his family should not buy whiskey." And then it kind of goes on to explain the House of Seagram counsels abstinence for some and moderation for all because such counsel is good business. I mean, they said the quiet part entirely out loud, but also there's a sense of the problem with alcohol in America is the individual poor choices that people have made. It's not us, the alcohol makers, because we're providing this wonderful luxury. It's that you're doing it wrong, you American drinkers.
Absolutely. And this is the great move, is to shift responsibility for problem drinker from the manufacturer to the individual. And what's fascinating about the Seagram campaign, which actually this is a campaign, a moderation campaign that unfolds over 5 decades. So they keep at it and at it and at it.
And this campaign to promote moderate drinking seems to be going pretty well until World War II breaks out. Because remember, World War I was the nail in alcohol's coffin the first time around. And people who want to bring Prohibition back are starting to make all of the same arguments over again.
The brewers, vintners, and distillers have to come back with an answer for this. And they all have their own separate pitch. Part of the brewers' campaign is to recast drinking itself as patriotic. And the wine industry does too. Wine and beer are morale boosters that keep people invested in the war effort. It's their reward for working hard in the defense factories. And, the brewers in particular lean into this idea that beer is something that the homesick GI longs for. It's that piece of Americana that the war is being fought to defend. And so that kind of makes drinking beer honorable.
And there's an ad again in your book that I just love. This is from 1944. It looks like it's the Brewing Industry Foundation that has put this forward. The tagline is, "Morale is a lot of little things." And and so you've got a GI who's writing a letter, and he's kind of like, and then we have his dream scenario where he's like, "I can imagine myself in my hammock now," and he's there, and his wife or girlfriend is standing next to him, and a cold glass of beer is there, and he's sort of lounging in the hammock and talking about all the little things he misses, and a glass of beer or ale. Not of crucial importance, surely, yet it is all the little things like this that help mean home to all of us, that do so much to build morale, ours and his. It's a very kind of both nostalgic, patriotic, like, why would we take that away from our poor GIs who are out there risking their lives, right?
Absolutely. And part of what they're doing there is putting beer on the same moral plane as a lot of other small, simple pleasures. So, the pleasure of getting a new hairdo or buying a new pair of shoes or fly fishing, all of these simple little pleasures that make daily living enjoyable, meaningful, that build community and strengthen family ties. All of those things are part of the message.
The real coup de grace for the brewers is the industrial nutrition. You have another ad, right? So I guess the brewers' yeast, or like the byproducts of making beer, they were able to then funnel into a nutritional supplement for livestock and even for soldiers, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly they were part of the war effort. Like, we're making America stronger with our brewing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is, I think, the brewing industry's most kind of clever answer to the prohibitionist charge that brewing is a waste of vital foodstuffs. Their answer back is no, we are ingenious recyclers who are making every grain count. And what they're saying is that the byproducts of the brewing process yield brewer's yeast, which is a really excellent source of vitamin B. Vitamin B just happened to be one of the most celebrated vitamins of the war that, can fight off fatigue and depression and keep industrial workers at their jobs. Eventually, they figure out how to get brewer's yeast into some of the soldiers' rations. So that argument really takes the wind out of the sails of the prohibitionist.
And not to be outdone, the winemakers of America find their own patriotic purpose in the mandatory food rations that made wartime diets so dreary.
And so the vintners come back and say, well, we have a way of making those drab leftovers taste much better. We have a way of making those cheap cuts of meat that are the only ones available in the market tender. We have a way of making unusual proteins like oxtails or organ meats that are more widely available, absolutely delectable. So this is a campaign to
cook with wine.
Yeah.
They're basically saying, drink it at the table and cook your food in it.
Yeah, it will flavor your meals, tenderize cheap cuts, and make everything food fit for company.
And then what? Just very briefly, what are the distilled spirits folks doing at this point?
So the distilled spirits folks have stopped making beverage alcohol because they've converted their entire production to making industrial alcohol, which is used to produce smokeless gunpowder and synthetic rubber. So they're producing 24/7 industrial alcohol. And many Americans who now have fattened wartime paychecks want to trade up to whiskey. It's the beverage that has more prestige. And so there are these shortages. You get black markets in whiskey. You get all sorts of violations of price controls, and it creates a real headache for the government that would prefer not to have to deal with any of this. But eventually, they realize that if they don't step in at all, price control violations of other kinds of goods might start getting worse as well.
Meanwhile, restaurants and taverns are pressuring the U.S. government to give the whiskey industry a break from wartime production to make some more of the drinkable stuff.
Sometimes it was referred to as a whiskey holiday.
Because?
We have a right to decent whiskey. And what's fascinating to me is that there are so many industries that are asking for a reprieve from wartime production so they can return to civilian production earlier. But many of those are denied that reprieve. The whiskey industry does get theirs. And so it does speak to a pretty dramatic cultural transformation in which the right to intoxicating pleasures now has some political sway.
Just as an aside, Jacobson was fascinated to see the same thing play out 80 years later during the COVID pandemic, when, you'll remember, liquor stores were designated essential services.
I was actually kind of surprised and mildly amused that, wow, everything else is shutting down, but these liquor stores are staying open. And what's really surprising is that it really wasn't an issue of public debate.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, back to World War II. Jacobson says that by the time the fighting was over,
alcohol has been transformed from something that's morally suspect into a normal, acceptable pleasure that simply is part of the good life.
But the alcohol makers don't yet feel comfortable enough to ease up on their marketing.
They're not really letting go. And part of the problem is that beer hasn't yet penetrated as broad of a middle-class market as they want. They want more middle-class consumers. They really want women. So they keep up this argument that casts beer drinking as respectable. They put it in these very middle and upper middle class settings, very fashionable. And eventually they sort of realize, we're kind of barking up the wrong tree. Maybe we should just go for our broader working class male audience. And they veer away from that.
So they stop trying to market to women and housewives, and it's more, I guess, more akin to the kind of beer advertising that we see today, where it's like handsome men with gorgeous women next to them, and there's like, it's sort of like a masculinity and entertainment enjoyment.
Absolutely. And I think they reach that point because they think we've done all we can and it's respectable enough. Let's just try to market to where we stand a chance of gaining market share.
So, Lisa Jacobson, when do we start to see the drink responsibly, penalties for drunk driving, like some of the concern about overconsumption, maybe thinking, I don't know, this moderation thing hasn't really worked out?
In the 1980s, there is a sense that drinking to excess continues to be a major problem. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is a leading sort of force in pressuring the government to impose stiffer penalties on drunk driving, pressuring the government to raise the drinking age from 18 to 21. And there are other groups who are joining them in advocating for adding warning labels about fetal alcohol syndrome. And all of that happens in the 1980s and in fact revives some of these anxieties and real defensiveness of the alcoholic beverage industry, who, some of whom are ready to sort of say, yeah, let's just put labels on it and do the responsible thing. But there's also this sense of we're embattled again.
How do we get to a place where moderate alcohol consumption is actually considered like part of a healthy lifestyle?
I think what's really interesting is that, I think this idea that moderate drinking is healthy, that really comes into play fairly late in the game. That's not an argument that winemakers and brewers are making after repeal. I think this idea that it's a net positive for your health is something that comes in after publicity about the French paradox. This idea, why can the French, eat all these fattening cheeses and fattening foods, but their incidence of heart disease is so much lower? And so the explanation of the French paradox is, well, they're drinking red wine, and that's the thing that offsets the problem.
What is changing today, do you think, about alcohol in American culture? I guess when I think about the Sober Curious movement and the Dry January, and even the Surgeon General coming out in a very forceful way at the beginning of 2025 saying, actually, alcohol is a leading cause of cancer, a leading preventable cause of cancer.
I think, we may be in the midst of a major cultural shift, which is the demotion of the moderate drinker. This ideal that had been created after repeal Now, suddenly, the scientific studies are saying no amount of alcohol is safe. And that really runs counter to what most moderate drinkers understood, which was that this may be beneficial. And if not beneficial, then it's certainly harmless. And it's part of what makes life a little bit more enjoyable.
Given what you know about the response of the alcohol manufacturers in moments of cultural shift, what kinds of messaging would you expect to see coming from them?
Right. Well, it will be interesting to see what tack they take. They might dig in their heels and simply ignore the new health warnings, and they might revive or revise the moderation playbook that had served them so well for many decades. Maybe it's not healthy for me, but maybe whatever harm is offset by the pleasures of enjoying wine with good company.
Lisa Jacobson is a professor of history at UC Santa Barbara, author of Intoxicating Pleasures, The Reinvention of Wine, Beer, and Whiskey After Prohibition. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor.
Thank you so much. This was fun. Thank you.
So what exactly do we know about alcohol's effect on health? Were all of those studies that suggested it was healthy just wrong?
There's been lots of studies that suggested that drinking small amounts of wine was good for your heart. But in the past 20 years, that's all changed. In the past 10 years, I think it's been debunked is too strong, but I think observational studies have gotten better and show that when you make adjustments, you get radically different results.
Next on Top of Mind, why there is so much confusion about alcohol's impact on health and what the science tells us now. I'm Julie Rose. This is the BYU Radio Podcast Network. Hey friends, if you are looking for another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, check out Constant Wonder. Host Marcus Smith takes you on an exhilarating journey through captivating stories of our magnificent natural world. You'll gain profound insight into different facets of our planet, discover more about nature, and maybe even ponder your connection to Earth's wonder. The show is Constant Wonder, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Ever since the U.S. dietary guidelines were first released back in 1980, the recommendation for alcohol consumption has been the same: 2 drinks or fewer per day for men and 1 drink or fewer for women. But now those recommendations are up for revision by the government, and there is some reason to suspect they might end up being lower when the new guidelines come out later this year. Tim Namey thinks that would be a good idea. He'd like to see the limit be just 1 drink a day for men. He was on the advisory committee that reviewed the guidelines. And back in the 1990s, he also helped start the CDC's first team focused on studying alcohol's health effects.
There was 2 of us, and alcohol was killing so many people. So I thought, what a great opportunity to start something new.
It was right when all that buzz around the French paradox was in full swing. Studies were coming out left and right about how a little alcohol was good for your heart and your health. And Namey says the science was legit. These were not junk studies.
What's changed in the last 20 years is observational studies have gotten better and show that when you make adjustments to the observational studies, you get radically different results.
So observational studies are when researchers take a group of people and watch them go about their lives and then look for patterns. They're not doing an experiment on people like this group gets alcohol, this group doesn't. And they're also not doing a longitudinal study where they follow people over the course of several years or even decades.
All of our studies around alcohol in the heart have been observational studies, which means they are not the best kind of studies. And they're prone to lots of difficulties. And I'm going to give you a flavor of a couple of the difficulties. One of them, and perhaps the most important of them, is the fact that people who drink small amounts of alcohol, particularly who are being studied in their 50s and 60s and 70s, right, tend to be better educated, have higher incomes, their children smile at them, they have nice retirement accounts. These are all reflections of a healthy life, and wine drinking is a reflection of that, but not its cause. But the point is that when you study wine drinkers, for example, they look healthier because people who tend to drink wine for whatever reason tend to have, again, better health insurance, all those kind of social factors that are make them look good.
Right. So they were healthy people anyway, and they just happened to also drink wine.
Let's talk about another major problem with these studies is that when you study somebody who drinks moderately, who's 60 years old, right, you enroll them in a study. The average age that most of us begin to drink is somewhere around age 19 or 20. Okay? If you were going to properly study the effect of alcohol, you would want to start following them from the day they start drinking until the day that they either die or have a heart attack or whatever you're trying to study. Most of these studies of alcohol begin when people are in their 50s or 60s. So somebody who's still drinking like a drink a day and they're in their 60s is somebody who didn't, for example, begin drinking when they were a teenager and die of a motor vehicle crash. They didn't become an alcoholic and become unavailable to be studied. They didn't get into a fight and end up with a traumatic brain injury. So people who are in these observational studies who are moderate drinkers are very different from if you said to people, hey, start drinking because it'll make you healthy. We have this other whole new class of studies, which is these Mendelian randomization studies, which are much stronger study design, and they find no benefits.
Mendelian randomization studies take genetic differences into account to get a better handle on cause and effect without the problems that typically come with observational studies. So basically, Naomi says we have better science now to show that if there is any health benefit to drinking alcohol, which is still very much in dispute, it's probably only true in very small amounts.
Imagine the shape of a capital letter J.
Naomi is describing here what's known as the J curve of alcohol's effect on the heart.
And I'm going to picture a graph, and along the bottom of the graph is the amount of one's alcohol consumption. And then along the part of the graph that goes up and down is the risk of, let's say, a heart attack or of dying early. Okay? The concept of the J-shaped curve is that at some level of consumption, the risk is lower than at zero consumption.
So where the curve of the J dips lowest is the lowest risk of heart attack or death. And that's not at 0 drinks, it's at something more than 0.
So the argument has been, well, where is the low point of that J-shaped curve, right? And where does it reside in terms of risk? But what I'm trying to tell you and maybe your audience is that wherever the J-shaped curve is, it's at a very small amount of alcohol. So again, even based on the older studies, the lowest level of risk or the bottom of that J is less than half a drink per day, somewhere in there.
Okay. And your point is that most people aren't doing that?
Even if you want to believe or have hope that maybe there's a tiny bit of benefit of drinking an occasional glass of alcohol, for most people, less is better, right? Because if there are any benefits to be found, it's to be found at having 1 or 2 or maybe 3 drinks per week, something like that.
And what these studies don't account for, says Naomi, is the way people actually drink.
In other words, they're all based on average consumption, which you can tell is a very inadequate representation of the way people actually drink. And the pattern of consumption, so if I drink 10 drinks a week and I have, let's say, 1 or 2 drinks 5 days a week versus I have 5 drinks 2 days a week, my risks are super different. Your average amount that you consume, right, is very much related to what we call chronic diseases, things like heart attacks, strokes, your risk of cancer, that sort of thing. But when we think about patterning, even if I drink 10 drinks a month and I drink 7 drinks one day and 3 drinks another, well, that time I'm drinking 7 drinks, my blood alcohol concentration is high. I'm at risk for motor vehicle crashes, beating up my wife, getting into a stupid argument with my friend, or doing something really dumb. So these are sort of other dimensions of alcohol-related problems that people tend to kind of forget about. And if you look in the U.S., a high percentage of, for example, sexual assaults, physical assaults, homicides, suicides, car crashes, drownings, etc., occur among people who have levels of alcohol in their bloodstream that impair them.
So I'm hearing you say that the risk goes up because of the consequences of behavioral choices, right? But what about the disease component, right? So we're hearing an awful lot about how alcohol consumption can contribute to cancer, for example, or heart disease is also one of the things that's mentioned. So in that regard, does it matter? Is the average really the only thing we care about, or is it the pattern of drinking?
That's another great question. I actually think that in 20 or 25 years from now, we will find out that the pattern with which you consume alcohol is as or perhaps more important than the total amount you consume. And that includes for things like heart disease and like cancer even. We know, for example, that binge drinking, which is usually defined as drinking 5 or more drinks in a row for men or 4 or more drinks in a row for women, is associated with heart attacks. Even people who consume moderate amounts of alcohol on average, and it looks like there's some protection from the older studies, people who binge drink, that protection disappears completely. The pattern of consumption also increases your risk of high blood pressure because high levels of blood alcohol concentration contribute to stiffness of blood vessels and raise your risk of high blood pressure. We know that high levels of consumption at one time, being impaired or drunk, raise your risk of atrial fibrillation. That's, the irregular heartbeat that many people have, and even relatively low amounts of alcohol raise that. And we know that binge drinking or heavy drinking episodes increase your risk of heart failure.
Now, on the cancer front, NAMI says the data is less clear about the consequences of binge drinking versus spreading drinks out. But
when our cells defend themselves, of course, any amount of the toxin or the carcinogen, in this case, ethanol, alcohol, can cause DNA damage or other factors that make us more prone to cancer. But many of the cells in our body have a threshold effect, meaning like the cell will be okay up until a certain point, and then it's like, boom, it's too high. So to the extent that there are threshold effects for alcohol killing different kinds of cells or damaging DNA, then I suspect patterning is actually a very important dimension of alcohol-related risk for cancer, but it just hasn't been as well studied.
Regardless of the relative risk associated with drinking a lot or a little in one sitting, NAMI says it has been clear for decades and recognized by the U.S. government and international health agencies that alcohol is a Group 1 carcinogen.
So a Group 1 carcinogen is the most carcinogenic type of substance. To be classified as a Group 1 carcinogen, you have to have compelling epidemiological studies of humans where you show increasing exposure to ethanol is associated with increase of that cancer. You have to have test tube studies that show when I add ethanol to this, I can induce, cell breakage or DNA damage of the kind that causes cancer. And you have to have animal studies where you can induce cancers in lab animals with that agent, in this case, ethanol. So both ethanol and its primary breakdown product in the human body, which is acetaldehyde, both of those chemicals are actually considered Group 1 carcinogens by the World Health Organization.
Yeah, that's a helpful point. And I wonder if you could put that in context for me, Dr. NAMI. So, I don't know, Americans are maybe a little wary of the whole, this is going to give you cancer, this is bad for you kind of warnings that we've heard over the years. I drink an inordinate amount of Diet Mountain Dew, I'm not ashamed to admit, and the artificial sweeteners in that will probably give me cancer, I've been told, right? The water we drink, the air we breathe, processed foods, like all of it, right? So how should I be thinking about this? Like, oh gosh, everything's going to give me cancer.
Your natural skepticism is good. I think people should be informed and make their own decisions. We all, myself included, do many things in life that involve some risks that we choose to take on, but we should know what those risks are. When you look at the big ticket things that are modifiable cancer risk factors in the United States, there are 3 biggies. Cigarette smoking, the combination of poor diet and physical inactivity, because we know that adiposity, being overweight, is a major risk factor for a number of cancers actually, and alcohol. Those are the big 3. Everything else is taking a back seat. But those 3 things are important to pay attention to.
So it's a kind of a false equivalence to be like, everything's going to kill
exactly.
me. So
I think it's good to be a good consumer of knowledge, but you first have to have the knowledge to be a consumer of it. And the relationship between alcohol and cancer has not been made available to the public. There is no information about that on, for example, alcohol labels. If you go to the store and you buy a can of peas, vegetable, not carcinogenic, you know what the serving size is. You know how many servings per container there are. You know how many calories are in it. Same thing even for tobacco and cannabis products in the US. They have health information, but for alcohol, there's nothing about the ingredients. There's nothing about the fact that alcohol causes at least 7 major kinds of cancer. There's nothing about the serving size. There's nothing about the servings per container.
There is some warning about like pregnant women.
There's a warning about pregnant women
drinking.
and operating heavy machinery that's in tiny font that's been there for 30 years.
Okay. I mean, and also there's like how much alcohol, like how much, I'm not an alcohol drinker, but there's some sort of like percentage alcohol, right?
That if you had to put information about the alcohol content of a container on something, the percent alcohol by volume is the most meaningless piece of information you could possibly put on there. The percent alcohol by volume is way less important than the number of standard drinks per container or the serving size of a standard drink, which is based on a set amount of ethanol. Or maybe somebody goes to their doctor and she says, "Hey, Tim, I want you to try to cut back and just limit your drinking to no more than a drink a day." And I'm like, she's a great doctor. Okay, I'm going to try to do that. And it's like, how would I do that? I have to do a lot of homework to figure out how much I'm even drinking, right? So a standard drink, there's the same amount of ethanol in a 12-ounce can of beer as there is in a 5-ounce glass of wine, as there is in 1.5 ounces or a shot of spirits. So that's assuming that there's at their standard strengths. The point is, I think we should have the same standards that are applied to other packaged food and beverage products in the United States, even ones that aren't Group 1 carcinogens. How about that?
Yeah. What is the conversation you'd like to see parents having with their children, their teens?
Conversations are good. Good examples are even better. So the main risk factor for kids with respect to their parents is not what their parents are saying, but it's what their parents are doing. So in other words, if you're somebody or a parent who drinks quite a bit or sort of makes alcohol a central part of their sort of social life or the home life, then having conversations with your children isn't that helpful. So I think that's really important, is just to kind of model drinking less, or, certainly not drinking to the point of being impaired, and just sort of making alcohol not a central part of the family experience at home. I think that's the main thing.
Dr. Namy, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tim Namy is a physician and a public health researcher. He's currently director of the Canadian Institute for Substance Abuse Research in Victoria. So I'm curious, what has your experience been with the status of alcohol in American culture? Are you sensing a shift as well? If you have kids, how do you talk about drinking with them? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Send an email to topofmind@byu.edu. And make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. You might also want to check out my other podcast. It's called Uncomfy, where we explore what it means to lean into moments that challenge us and why it's worth the discomfort. I talk to people who share their own personal stories. You can watch or listen to Uncomfy on YouTube, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Isabella Sosa and Vanessa Goodman, with help from Abby Karras, Samuel Benson, Sam Payne, and me. Our audio engineer is Lauren Sandberg. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.